Welcome, everyone. We are continuing our series of things that we've been putting off, and we're going to throw a twist in here today, something you may not have thought of before, and that is emotions you've been putting off, feelings you've been putting off. And we wanted to bring you the expert on this, and we brought in Aundi Kobler, and she is a licensed professional counselor, a speaker, and an author. And you have probably heard of her through her groundbreaking book, Try Softer, and its companion, The Try Softer Guided Journey. Aundi is the owner of Kolber Counseling, and it was established in 2009. You probably have seen her on shows such as Good Morning America. She has come out with several books after, and she also is a survivor of trauma and a lifelong learner. And so she brings that hard-won knowledge to the conversation today. And you are just going to hear her words about the work of change and the power of redemption and the beauty of experiencing God with us in our pain and right in the middle of our emotions. So, Aundi, welcome to the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight.
So, I want to start just by talking about your view in why did Try Softer? I mean, it sold over 100,000 copies and was a wild success. It really struck a chord. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, thanks for all your kind words. And yeah, with Try Softer, it has been and continues to be such an interesting journey. I really wrote that in like the small margins of really early motherhood. I mean, the very first drafts were literally during when my youngest, was taking naps. But a part of it was like this overflow of my own experience, partly as at that point I'd been a therapist for probably around 11 years. And I had really been doing a lot of work around, a lot of my original training really focused a lot on talk therapy, which I think there's a lot of value to that. But what I had come to find, and in my own both clinical work, but also personally, was that sometimes it's sort of like talking could only get us so far. If you've ever had that experience where you know something in your brain and you're not experiencing the truth of it in your body. And I felt like I was constantly running into that in that way of being. A lot of times, like this concept of Try Softer was part of the transformation of my own journey, because part of the way I really survived a pretty traumatic childhood was by becoming an extremely high achiever, what I call white knuckling, pushing myself really hard, often disconnecting from myself. And just a whole myriad of things happen. And I really believe God designed our bodies to survive. And so there's a lot of ways I'm actually really grateful for the ways that I was able to adapt. But what I had to really contend with in my adulthood was, why was I unable to receive a lot of the care, the goodness, sometimes from people around me, but also from God? Why was that not sinking into the deepest parts of me? And so Try Softer has been my work and my attempt to say, psychologically, there's a lot behind like what it looks like to participate with God in healing. And so this concept, it was originally said to me by a dear supervisor when I was a young, really new counselor. I was beginning to learn, like he said to me so kindly, Aundi, what would it be like if you could change your posture in this situation? I wonder if you could try softer. And it is sort of like taken my whole career to say, okay, well, what would that actually look like? And so what I would say is that it's really been this work of, I think it landed at a time when we have a culture who is exhausted. We were just about to go through the pandemic. That's when it came out, was 2 months before the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
Right. So people were already tired, already burnt out. And then you get a global pandemic. right?
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever stores you might have been holding on to be able to continue to white knuckle it, for so many people, I think they hit kind of sometimes a rock bottom or a wall or whatever that looked like. And I think people have just been sort of hungry to hear, like, could there be a different way? And is there a different way that is in fact in alignment with this faith, with my faith that is so important to me? And so it has been a deep honor. I would just say one of the honors of my life. Like, I had no idea, truly no idea. I did not expect this. I hoped a few people would read it.
Yeah.
And I have been proud of the work, but I just truly didn't. You just don't know. You just don't know.
I think one of the, you and I, well, we were talking before the interview about also you being a college athlete, and we have that in common. And I think hearing what you just said there about being a survivor of trauma and then also being an athlete, you just learn to have grit and to dig in. And when it gets hard, you keep pushing. And when you're in the fourth quarter, you got to fight harder. And I just think this is so interesting, even how you grew up and how you were made for you to come to this place of saying, okay, that serves a purpose. And it did serve a purpose in my life. And in a lot of ways, it was a gift in my life. But in some ways, it's also preventing me from moving forward, that mentality. And I can really relate to that. And I think other people probably have their own version of that, whatever that is, whatever they have learned to use to grit it out, to push through, to push, to say, I'm putting that aside and I'm going to work really hard. So, as we dive into this topic of emotions we've been putting off, and what is it in us that doesn't allow ourselves to step into that space very well sometimes?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love how you named that and honored the truth of that. I think this is really common, whether someone is a trauma survivor or not. And I think our culture tends to, really, and I won't even go all the way down the road, but in a way, that's why I wrote my second book, Strong Like Water, is
Mm-hmm.
because I love to play with paradoxes, right? Because we have views of strength in our culture that really align with saying strength is push your emotions down. Don't name your needs. Don't talk about what you're feeling unless you're coming from a place of power or aggression, kind of, there. And then we have Jesus, right? Who is just like the total paradox, who's like, when you're weak, you're strong. The first shall be last. Who's like, come to me if you're weary. And ultimately, like, you will have life to the full. Wow, so many paradoxes, right? And so to go back to your original question around this, I think first and foremost, I actually want to honor that there's a wisdom to our bodies around not always feeling our emotions. Now, I'm going to give you some caveats because there's a lot to it. But the reason is, like, for example, if you take my childhood, it literally and truly was not safe for me to say, hey, this isn't okay. I'm not okay. Here's how I'm feeling. My body, and there's some really amazing and intricate ways that our bodies are designed to constantly assess for safety or threat. And a lot of this is happening under our conscious awareness. And so when our body perceives we don't have a certain level of safety, we're not necessarily saying to ourselves, don't feel your emotion. Our body switches into a way of operating, whether conscious or not, that often includes suppressing emotion. Because if our body perceives, like, let's just say, it's a caregiver that will shame you or become terrifying or just simply is avoidant because you are expressing an emotion, our bodies will adapt to that, right? Now, that's not everybody's story. That's not everyone's experience. Sometimes there has been a relatively stable experience, or it's not explicit that emotions aren't okay. But maybe we pick up other cues. Maybe it's that, we see that somebody else is really preoccupied. So we internalize a message. Well, I don't want to put anything else on them. So I'm not going to talk about how I'm feeling because I don't want to like make them feel badly. Or maybe we get a distorted picture of faith that
Yeah.
says, for example, this idea of when we deny ourselves, that is denying this part of our humanity. When really, maybe if we can weed through that a little bit more, it's having the ability to recognize, like, is this in alignment with who God made me to be? God, would you empower me to set that down?
Hmm.
Right? So I want to just say that there's usually a reason. In fact, I'll amend that and say there's always a reason.
Yeah.
There's always a reason. We have learned consciously or unconsciously to suppress our emotion or to disconnect from it. And sometimes that will be done consciously, like we know we can't feel it. And so we're like actively working on it. And sometimes we've been so disconnected for so long, we don't even have the awareness that there's all these emotions that we won't feel. All we know is when somebody starts asking us about it, maybe we get frustrated. We might get angry. We might want to leave. These are all really normal experiences that have happened because our bodies begin to perceive emotions as unsafe when we have not had the support we have needed to feel them.
It's good.
So if you are a person who's listening and you're like, whoosh, this kind of feels big to me. Like, it's kind of like that feeling. I've had so many clients through the years tell me like, oh man, if I open
Yes.
that container, I do not know what's going to come out. And that terrifies me. And so I always just like to say, this is where I think this is the goodness of God to us, that our work is not to bring, and this is in a way where Trisofter comes in, let's bring this Trisofter approach to this work. To say, you don't have to feel every emotion that you haven't felt for 20 years right now. There is no
good
pressure.
News.
Yeah, we are not in a marathon race to feel so quickly. But instead, what we can begin to do, I often come with like, let's just honor. Let's just acknowledge even that it feels scary. That in and of itself is an emotion, right? And that there's this wisdom. Our body is saying, I don't know yet if I have everything I need. And so for some people, it's going to actually be important to say, like, maybe we need to actually find a therapist in that work as I unpack. Maybe it's a group of friends that I feel like, okay, I know if I speak this thing, like, or if I begin to unpack this, like, I feel like held. In what ways is a relationship with God or faith a resource there? Because in so many ways, when you begin this work, it's kind of like when you go hiking. You don't want to be halfway up the mountain and then be like, what did I want to bring with me? Right? As much as possible, we want to consider, what might I need before I begin so I can do this work in a way that is tolerable, that is doable, and ultimately moves us towards wholeness. Because, and I'll just say this, obviously I have a lot to say about emotions, but emotions are not good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have never heard that in their life. They've heard, only if you're happy, like only if it's comfortable, only if it's fill in the blank, is it acceptable. But what we know about emotion is that it's really truly like your body is giving you information. And the more that we can, at the pace we're able, tune into the information, it allows us to, like, for example, let's say you're like in the company of someone and you have just started to learn to really be more connected to your body, and you're noticing when you're with that person, you've got a knot in your stomach. Like you're just feeling that, right? A lot of people, if you've been disconnected from your emotions, will ignore that, will shame that, will make it their own fault. But what about if we could just be curious? What if we could just notice? It's not like we're like trying to say this person is automatically bad.
Right.
But this information is informing us to say, hey, will you just notice that when you are with this person, you're experiencing a little bit of your body's maybe not feeling completely safe. And that could be about the past, it could be about the present, or it could be about both. But that's just like an example of the many ways emotion informs how we are showing up in the world, and how important it is to listen at the pace, to respond and feel at the pace that we're actually able.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that you said emotions are not good or bad. They're information. And at the same time, emotions can be very scary. I think a lot of people, hold on, I'll speak from my own experience, don't want to open that floodgate because they're afraid of what is going to come. Can you speak to that fear?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is just to say, like, a lot of times we have learned that often because it's been shown to us that maybe someone else couldn't handle our emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe there's been multiple people, or maybe there's been a pattern, right, that we've learned. And so what happens, because this is how our body works, is that if that's how we've been witnessed, or a lack of witnessing in our pain, we internalize that experience. And we begin to say, okay, that is how I then need to respond to my emotion too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes a narrative then in our mind, like, oh, I can't, that's too big. I can't feel that, right? And now, again, with the caveats, sometimes that's also connected to something that maybe at the time of it being experienced was overwhelming, disturbing, painful. Our nervous system perhaps was flooded. And when that happens, our body may have encoded that experience as saying, don't come back here. Do everything you can not to feel this again. Right. And so both of those things, and sometimes both of those can be true at the same time. And so what I want to say to that fear is we don't want to shame the fear. We don't want to say to that fear, well, you know what? Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You know,
right.
You know what? Kind of like we talked about the athletes at the beginning, just push no matter the cost, right? So what we're looking for in that kind of work is we're kind of trying to create an internal negotiation. And we're trying to say, like, I wonder if I could give myself permission. I kind of think of it like, can I dip just my pinky toe in? Right? So if this emotion is a huge, like, ocean, all I'm looking for right now is my literal pinky toe to acknowledge that the emotion exists. And in doing that, what I'm trying to help communicate to my body is there's a form of integration. Yes, there's an emotion there. Yes, it's a valid emotion, but also I don't need to feel it all at once. I can work and gain capacity to maybe tomorrow I'll do 2 toes. Right? Maybe, a really popular phrase that I say in therapy, which is kind of a weird phrase when you think about it, to be honest, but it's like, how do you eat an elephant?
Right.
You do it one bite at a time. And the reality is some emotion is like that. It's like an elephant. right? Like I think about grief for people, grief that has not been acknowledged or felt. This is a really common one that people feel afraid of. And so what we're looking for is the curiosity to say, would anything feel tolerable right now? And sometimes it doesn't. And what that actually means is, oh, I need more support before I can go any further.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say this, because I think sometimes it's helpful to know the trajectory of what emotion might look like. Because I know I'm talking about it in this very guarded way.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, emotion is really designed to ebb and flow. And when we have sort of the felt safety, I have enough support, I have enough capacity, the hope is that like I have an experience or emotion and I am able to just sort of feel it, kind of like an ocean wave. It maybe kind of comes in. I notice it maybe even peaking like, oh man, maybe for example, that's a little uncomfortable. I'm staying with it for a moment. And then it actually begins to dissipate. And this idea actually mirrors how our body literally processes even trauma. I mean, this is ultimately what's happening, even when you process trauma. But even emotion, like I see my child at the bus stop, I'm happy to see them, that I feel the emotion dissipates. It's meant to be more like a dance. Mm-hmm. Where things go awry is when we've got all these emotions and they're never able to be felt, right? Mm-hmm. There's a whole seawall of experiences. And so I just share that to say, like, this is the big trajectory, that we would ultimately have the compassion, the safety to be able to allow these things to ebb and flow, knowing that we will remain, like we will be okay. We will find our footing and our grounding. But it sometimes and often takes some work to get there, and that's okay.
I'm hearing some really interesting things from you. One is the piece of getting curious instead of judgmental about your emotions, I think is really important. That if we can start to get curious and we can pull back from them almost a little bit to allow ourselves to name them and then to pull back from it and say, why is that? What is that bringing up for me? So I really, that feels important. The other thing that you're touching on is the support, the community around you. I was just texting with a friend this morning. I'm facing a really difficult physical challenge right now. And how I said it to her was, I said, this is mine to carry, but you being on my team is really important. This is a really, like, you're an important part of this journey for me because it's allowing me to walk through it with a stronger stroke. And so I love that too, is what I heard you say is that, the support can come in many ways. But for me, I've got some key people that are really helping me to face what's happening, to face my emotions around what's happening. And that has been critical for me. So I feel like I'm in real time experiencing that. Here's my follow-up question to that. How, for people who are struggling to face their emotions, maybe someone listening who says, okay, I want to, what is an exercise or two that person can do to help themselves transition into that place?
Yeah, no, I think great insights there. And thank you for sharing that, because I think this is such a real part of being human. And I think this is something that comes up in every phase and season and part of our life. Like, it doesn't really go, like, we need people and we need to be able to feel. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, so a couple of thoughts, and then I'll give you some ideas for some exercises. And so the first thing I would say is, like, if you are one of the people who's in the category where, like, this feels big, this feels like a lot. One of the things I would actually encourage you to be aware of is we want to do our best to build capacity to acknowledge our emotion without getting flooded.
That's
And what I
good.
mean, thank you. Yeah. So what I mean by that is I won't go fully into the concept, but I talk a lot about it in Try Softer and Strong Like Water. There's a concept called the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is basically, it's coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. And it's this idea that we have a range of arousal in which we can feel our feelings or have an experience or really go through anything. And if we are within that range, or if we even are staying connected to that range, because we can even go out a little bit outside of it, our brain, a part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex stays online, which is a really essential part of what we need to be able to process what we're feeling. And so essentially, if we begin to feel an emotion and we leave that window, it's actually no longer helpful to feel it. In fact, the potential for that emotion, especially if it's connected to something that maybe has like maybe it's connected to trauma or something really disturbing, again, it's no longer helpful. It can potentially become re-traumatizing. And this is where pacing matters and where the wisdom of listening to our individual bodies and nervous systems is literally essential. And so for anyone listening, if we can begin to do things like, so for example, a body scan is the practice of just taking a moment. Like, let's say I'm thinking about meeting with a friend and we've had some conflict and we're going to get together and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. Right. So let's say I take a moment and I do a body scan, which is sort of thinking of, right now, let's say I'm in my window of tolerance, but I'm going to use this idea of almost like a laser going over my body as I think about the event. And as I do that, maybe I notice like some tightness in my chest. And if I'm able, one thing we can do, so this is from Dr. Dan Siegel, name it to tame it. If I can take that sensation, because sensations are actually the roots of emotions. And once we name them, they become feelings, which is a really interesting evolution. So feelings, I know, fascinating, right? And we don't necessarily, not that we have to always, you don't have to always go by the book on what you call it. But what's important to know is that feelings are rooted in our body. And so we don't want to bypass our body by thinking our feelings. We actually want to be in our body to feel the feeling, because that's what allows it to move through, right? So if I'm noticing that tension, and then maybe I get curious and I'm like, okay, is there an emotion? Is there a word that matches what I'm experiencing in my chest? And maybe I'm feeling a little angst, or maybe I'm feeling a little worried, right? And so you kind of are taking a moment and you're just noticing that. Now, for some people, that might be as far as you go. Like, your body will tell you. Like, if that's as far as you can go, then all we want to do at that point is we could use maybe the language of a part of me. I'm aware a part of me is feeling angsty and worried. Because in that moment, if we try to process the emotion too quickly, our body will sometimes be like, don't do that to me. I'm not ready to be done with this emotion. Right? And so just observing and naming the emotion in and of itself often will bring down the intensity of the emotion. Because in a way, it's almost like a friend hearing you, right? That feeling, you say something to somebody and they're not giving you advice or anything. They just hear you. That's actually what we're doing for ourselves in our emotions. And that witnessing helps to create a form of integration in our body that begins to potentially allow it to kind of move, to maybe lower. Another way that we could work with something like this is we could ask. Now, again, lots of choice here. If this doesn't feel like someone is in a place to do it, you could actually ask that sensation in your body. And you could say, look, and this is what I say to clients sometimes, if that sensation could speak, what would it say? And what we're doing here, again, this is a way of giving voice to something that maybe we haven't quite had the capacity to turn towards or to listen. And so in doing that, you might get other information. It could be, I'm afraid that this friendship is going to end. I'm worried what will happen when I finally speak like what I feel. It could be, this reminds me of being 12 and I was left out and nobody, like I tried to talk to my friend about it and I lost my friendship. Right? So these are just like examples of the ways that things that come up. And so as we're doing that, sometimes things will be what I would call a little bit more clean. Like you'll notice it, you'll be with it, right? So in Try Softer, I talk about compassionate attention. And that's when we are in our window of tolerance, but we're observing what we're experiencing. We are with that feeling. Mm-hmm. And often that sometimes is enough. Sometimes though, when there's a stickiness and it's not moving through, that's maybe a sign. That's when we might need more support. That's when we might need to, okay, I'm going to do this now and I'm going to journal later and I'm going to talk to my therapist and I'm going to stay curious. And you know what I mean? Like it's this process of just giving ourselves permission to say, God designed our bodies with lots of wisdom. And so if we can slow down and give that permission, give that wisdom permission to sort of unwind, oftentimes we're in a really good position to be able to act on it in ways that alleviates a lot of the suffering.
Do you use internal family systems in your practice?
I do. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I have a friend, Jill, she was actually on the podcast recently and she does as well. She's a very good friend. And she asked me some of those questions a lot. Like if that part of you could speak, what would it say? And it's been very insightful for me because I've never done that kind of therapy, but she's almost like, she is a therapist and she's like my therapist. And in that way, she's a friend therapist, but it is helpful to name it, to let it speak. And I think what's so interesting about this concept is we think that somehow if we name it, it's going to be worse when the opposite is true. And that is a phenomenon that I'm surprised by over and over because I know that cognitively, but I don't always believe that. And yet we have to trust that that is true. The only way through is through. So we have to be able to say it and name it in order to get through it, to get past it, to heal from it. But our brains tell us, no, scary, danger, and they stop us from doing that. And even no matter how long we've been doing it, we still have to kind of call out that lie.
Yeah, no, I think that knowing ultimately where we're going is the helpful piece of like saying like, maybe it was true when I was younger that I couldn't name how I was feeling. And now here's what I know, right? And what I would say is this is where we want to keep an eye on that window of tolerance.
Yeah, that's good.
Because, and this is where things starts to get a little bit like we're holding, I think of it like, I joke with people like writing Try Softer was like herding cats. Because I kind of wrote it how I do therapy, and how I do therapy is like weaving, right? Because I'm like, oh, here we are, and here we are, and here we are. Because it's not simple, because we're not simple. And that's
it's not
okay.
Linear.
Right. Yes. Yep. And one thing I will just say is that ultimately it's when we're in that window that the truth becomes a resource. But often when we're out of the window, if someone tries, like think about for yourself, right? Or I'll think about for myself, like, let's say you are just you are like, you are outside of that window. It was one of those days. It was whatever that was. And somebody says something to you, and it does not matter how true it is in that moment. Because when that prefrontal cortex is offline, Dan Siegel calls it like losing your lid or popping your top, something like that. Essentially, we're all in survival brain. And survival brain will always lean towards, basically, even like research shows, if someone is in survival brain and someone even has a neutral face, they may still potentially perceive them as being threatening.
It's good.
And so if you are a person who has a history of trauma, which is me, I say the stakes are higher for trauma survivors. Because once we're in the survival brain, all the old patterns of survival are, it is not safe, whatever the thing is that you've needed, whatever the patterns, the narratives, and we can heal those, right? So I just want to be mindful. I'm not saying it's for all time. It's that this is more like a dance. This is a dance. And so I think one other resource that I might just share with you that I think for me, and really for anyone I work with, is just as we're able to develop self-compassion. And self-compassion may not sound automatically like something you would talk about when you're talking about emotion. But I think, and again, I talk about this in Try Softer, like as stewarding the compassion of God towards ourselves, that we get to participate in that. And Dr. Krista Neff has done a lot of research and work around how effective self-compassion is. Like, it's not this thing that like, oh, now I get to just like never, take accountability. It's that we honor that we are a human, that this is hard, that there's pain, and that ultimately also that we're not alone. We're not the only one that has suffered, and we're not alone in our suffering. And in doing that kind of a work, sometimes the only thing that we can do, like when we feel really stuck, is to have compassion for how hard it is to feel stuck. And what's so beautiful about that is that the compassion itself is a form of safety. And neurobiologically, what that does over time is it builds our capacity to change, to feel, to grow, to be with ourselves. Because shame, hate, those things simply they cannot get us where we need to go. It is literally neurobiologically impossible because they are too threatening to our bodies. And so I just think about, for the person for the things that I have said, that they're like, that's nice, I can't do it. That's nice, I can't do that. What would it be like to begin to imagine a dear friend in the same position you're in? And what would you want to say to that friend? And when you think about that friend who's in pain, what do you feel in your body about your friend? And maybe you could just see an experiment to see, could you borrow just a little bit of that compassion towards your friend? Could you have even 10% of that towards yourself?
Yeah. And as people of faith, I think we can ask too, what is Jesus' posture to this person? And if you have to externalize it and pretend it's somebody else, what would Jesus' posture be to my friend if you can't say to me yet? Yeah. And then we can experience that grace because we can visualize the compassion and the grace. I know we are running out of time, but I do have one more question. I think a lot of our audience is dealing with change in life right now. And I wonder how much of the emotions that we're feeling when you peel back the onion of naming to get to the root is grief. And I'd just like you to speak to those that may be afraid to grieve change and the changes that they're experiencing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great insight that, change, whatever the reason for the change, because there's so many different ways. There's really what most people would consider positive change. And then there's the changes that come from things like death. There's the changes that comes from bittersweet, like kiddos growing up, kiddos leaving. All of these have different qualities to them to some extent. But one of the realities of change is grief. And sometimes I think for different reasons, people discount their reason for getting to grief, right? So if it's what someone, like let's say someone gets to move to a new house and they're excited about the house, it could be easy to discount the grief of leaving the house that you've lived in or where you lived, whatever that means, right? Or the category, obviously with death, a lot of times people, or different kinds of death, maybe it's a relational death. Maybe it's all these different things that I think we often talk ourselves out of, right? And that's our body often trying to keep us safe because maybe we've perceived the grief is dangerous. Maybe I'll never come out of the grief, for example, right? And so I think in many ways, I would just like to say that it's normal. Like first and foremost, just to hear that the grief that you might be experiencing for any type of change is really valid. And it's normal that you would be. And that, I think in a culture that oftentimes doesn't acknowledge grief, emotions, but let alone grief, and let alone what I would call disenfranchised grief. Well, that's not my term. I forget who said it, but disenfranchised grief, which is when it's a pain that is not acknowledged. Like it's not something where someone says, oh, this happened to you. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Right? Because most people maybe don't see the thing that you've experienced as being worthy, quote unquote, of that grief. And so it actually takes a lot of courage to recognize and to name, oh, this is bringing up grief for me. That even the change in and of itself, whether it comes from a place that ultimately you're glad about or not, that in and of itself, that is valid. And I think as we then, grief is not, and I know you both know this, but grief is not a diagnosis. And neither are our emotions, right? But that grief is a natural response to losing things that we love, or to the recognition of the absence of things that are valuable or that we love. And so I think, and this actually pulls on some internal family systems threads, is to say, what would it be like as I am able to give that grief like a seat at the table? And it's not to say that your whole identity needs to be grief, right? Like this is again where that window of tolerance matters, that we want to be with it instead of being lost in it. But being with it matters. The withness matters. And so what would the hospitality look like in your own heart, in your soul, in your body to allow the grief? Maybe even you write it a letter. Maybe it's a kindness of giving yourself permission to go really slow and notice the things that are changing and seeing them and allowing the things that bubble up to be felt and as you're able to move, right? And so all of these things, I just name that these are real parts of being human. And I think it's really scary sometimes to let ourselves feel those things, particularly, honestly, in our culture.
Yeah. Yes. And I think as we move as we move into this new year, that this can be part of our work this year, is that we want to be We want to heal those places that need healing so that we can be more abundantly who we are. And that really is the why. The why is because God created us uniquely, and he wants the John 10:10 life for us, to have life to the full. And part of having life to the full is moving to this more healed place. And this world is hard, and we are going to have to heal multiple times from it. And so thank you. Thank you for this conversation and for the work that you're doing. And I think one of the things that people can do in 2025 is get your newest book, which is a compilation of all your writing, which will walk people through more of this. And so can you just speak briefly about what kind of tool that could be for people this year?
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. And I think, part of the reason why I wanted to do this book, Take What You Need, is because, and in a way, it actually fits really well with, I think, the tone of our conversation around emotion, because I really designed it, along with my editor, who's been so supportive and wonderful, to kind of come from a place of like, maybe we don't dive into the deep end in this moment. But what would it be like to begin to just notice and check in with your body? And then the way the book is set up is there's all these little mini chapters. And it's like, take what you need when you're exhausted. Take what you need when you feel alone. Take what you need when you need to know God is with you, or when you need to feel your feelings. Like there, and so it's sort of a practice. In many ways, it is the work of compassionate attention. And really what facilitates emotional processing is to check in with ourselves and to really sort of give ourselves, like, participate with God and giving ourselves the hospitality. That's kind of how I think of this concept. Like God is so hospitable to us. God sets a table for us and is like, come and eat, like all these things. And part of that is based off of our unique stories and histories and what we actually need. And so my hope is to kind of bring that sort of energy and spirit to this book, that it would feel really generous to the reader to say, look, like Jesus came to teach us the unforced rhythms of grace. So you are just invited. Like, may you just have all you need to listen. And then may you partake in the way that you need to your specific self, your specific story. So I'm really excited about this. I'm calling it a contemplative coffee table book. But it's like kind of, it's very aesthetically driven. Like it's like botanicals, and we worked really hard on just making it something that feels like, I hope when readers hold it, like it will feel like a resource to their body, like to them as they're doing their work. So I'm really excited about it.
Well, I am too. Aundi. I'm going to be giving this book to a lot of people. So thank you for putting it together, and thank you for being on today. What a gift.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It really was a pleasure to chat with you both.